In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. This past week, I had an encounter with a beggar. This is not unusual. They like to hang out at traffic intersections and scam the gullible. On Tuesday, I was stopped at the intersection of LaSalle and Lafayette in South Bend. A white man who appeared to be in his 20s approached my car. He was tall and thin, not emaciated. He looked relatively healthy. His clothes were dingy, but not rags. He had a rosary wrapped around his left hand, as if he were praying on the streets at 7:55 in the morning. It is a nice accessory in a Roman Catholic town like South Bend, especially since we were only about 2 miles from the campus. He made some gestures like he was hungry. He put his hand to his mouth and then to his stomach. I mouthed the word no. He tried again. I repeated my answer. He moved on. I don't put any Christian-themed stickers or messages on my car. I don't want the attention. I don't want to be a target for beggars who see Christians as easy marks. I also don't want the scorn of the masses who would denounce me for not giving money to beggars. Would giving that young man money on Tuesday morning have been compassionate? After all, Jesus gives us the example of compassion in this gospel and throughout the New Testament. Shouldn't we just give to those who ask, just in case there is a real need? Isn't the giving a good deed, regardless of how the gift is used? Another pastor I knew would take that attitude. He would give regardless of how obvious the beggar's scam was. Because of this, beggars would come weekly, if not multiple times a week, to his church to get money for their dying mother in Alabama or whatever the story was. Just a couple of dollars. What is it to give to beggars like this? Is it because we are afraid and want them to move away from our car as quickly as possible? Is it to feel good about ourselves? We feel proud that we did a good deed today. Or do some people really believe the act? The beggar counts on the urge among many to nurture and care for those who are suffering and exploits those desires. Is this ritual of exploitation and gratification compassion? It seems much more like prostitution. The beggar is the prostitute, and the giver is buying the bliss of making a difference in the world. This doesn't seem like compassion to me. The manipulation of emotions is very common. The news media has turned this into a science. This is why it is often called infotainment. Movies and television tap into desires to nurture all the time. And it has always been this way. The theater has been telling tragedies since the dawn of Western civilization. Aristotle believed that the object of tragedy was the purgation or discharge of pity and fear for those who participate as observers in the experience. St. Augustine denounced the artificial nature of the theater. He said, "But what sort of pity can we really feel for an imaginary scene on the stage? The audience is not called upon to offer help, but only to feel sorrow. And the more they are pained, the more they applaud the author." This is not real pain or real compassion. Again, Augustine said, "Of course, this does not mean that we must arm ourselves against compassion. There are times when we must welcome sorrow on behalf of others, but for the sake of our souls, we must beware of uncleanness." Today, reality television is little more than pornography. Not in the sexual sense, but in the sense that it elicits an ersatz emotion, an empty compassion. Someone else's child trapped in a well on TV monopolizes the attention of millions of Americans who neglect their own children or entrust them to the care of strangers. These artificial moments of compassion surround us in our lives, and we are overwhelmed with people insisting that they are real. In our society, the greatest expression of morality is to wear a t-shirt or display a bumper sticker that says, "Be kind." And yet, even with all of this fake compassion, the real thing is not negated. There is real compassion. Our Lord displays it, and the apostles teach us to exercise it in our lives. There is real care for the sick, real feeding of the hungry, real protection of the vulnerable. If any of you have seen that new movie that's out, it may be a fictionalized version of it, but only a little. The real issue of child trafficking is quite real, and the protection of them is real. We should mercilessly excise artificial compassion from our lives, not only because it is useless, but because it actually causes damage to others. But we should also seek ways to engage in genuine compassion within the parameters of our vocation. Very few people are equipped to help others far outside their own immediate family and friends. Most of us have callings that limit our reach to many others that we do not know. Few of us have the money, time, or ability to help very many others. But if we fulfill our vocations to those in our immediate orbit, the world will be a better place. Charity begins at home. Slow, steady service in one's vocation lifts up all those around you. I have, for a while now, been frustrated with Tucker Carlson and a faction of the political right in America that have been vehemently opposed to helping Ukraine over the last year and a half. One of the claims he makes is that Ukraine's welfare is no business of the United States. And there are some ways in which that sentiment is true. The American government, at least theoretically, is in existence for the benefit of the American citizenry, not the population of the world. It is also very difficult to explain why young men from Michigan should go and fight and die in far-flung locations of the world. Most people are not interested in imperial adventures for conflicts they neither understand nor care about. But this sort of turning inward logically ends with no one and nothing being America's business or my business. If Ukraine is none of America's business, why would Great Britain be our business? Why would Canada be our business? On an individual level, why should I care about California? I've never been there. I don't know anyone from there. Why should I care about California more than Ontario? Because of some arbitrary political border? I have more cultural attachment to Ontario, which is only 3 hours away by car. It is true that on a national level, one cannot be involved in every conflict in the world. Not every issue worthy of our attention can be solved. We must be realistic and sober about this flawed and sin-soaked world. I would argue in the case of Ukraine, America is well positioned to support their defense with minimal expense. Just as a data point, the $40 billion given to Ukraine so far is what America spent in Iraq and Afghanistan every 3 months for nearly 2 decades. And America gets to weaken an enemy, Russia, without sacrificing her own sons. But not everything is the same. Iraq and Afghanistan did not work out nearly as well, and we did have to stand by helplessly as both of them sank back into savagery and backwardness. And if Taiwan is invaded, who knows what can be done or not done? Compassion is not easy to exercise effectively in every situation. The world is messy and complicated. It can be confusing on a personal level as well. I once knew a family who adopted a child from India. I wasn't close with them, but you know. The couple already had several children of their own, but felt compelled to help a child from the other side of the world. At first, one might think this action was a perfect expression of compassion. But after a year, it became apparent that the child from India had multiple profound mental and physical problems. The couple were soon spending all of their time dealing with the child's sometimes violent antisocial behavior and spending all their time on both medical and psychological treatment for the child. Their own biological children were largely being ignored, and in any inheritance that there might have been was being frittered away. It is a tragedy. We should remember our vocations when we exercise compassion. Fulfill your vocation and know what is not your vocation. August Hermann Francke was a Lutheran clergyman in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. He was not a great example of orthodoxy. He was one of the heads of pietism, actually. Though compared to today, he was not that bad. His main virtue was his genuine compassion and works of mercy. He was a professor at the University of Halle, but also founded an orphanage. At the very outset of his labors, he had been profoundly impressed with a sense of his responsibility toward the numerous outcast children who were growing up around him in ignorance and crime. After a number of tentative plans, he resolved in 1695 to institute what is often called a ragged school, supported by a public charity. A single room was first sufficient, but within a year it was found necessary to purchase a house, to which another was added in 1697. In 1698, there were 100 orphans under his charge to be clothed and fed, besides 500 children who were taught as day schoolers. The schools grew in importance and were later known as the Frankische Stiftungen. At the time of Franke's death, the schools were frequented by more than 2,300 pupils. Franke's schools provided a prototype which greatly influenced later German education. One example. We must, of course, be aware of false notions of compassion, while taking inspiration from godly forms of compassion. Jesus is our example, and he gives us the ability to know the difference. Amen.